I would have loved to be here at that conference in October too, but I'm going to be, Tom and I will be in Europe at the time, and it was way too long a commute, so we're going to miss that. But this is sort of the consolation prize here. We happened to be in San Francisco, and we said, well, you know, Vancouver's kind of close to San Francisco, at least from our perspective in Minneapolis. So we sort of dropping by on the way home. And I'm going to talk about a little bit about the lean mindset in general first. Of course, this doesn't really, oh, there we go. Okay, I'm going to talk about the capitalist dilemma, because when we come to Vancouver, we like to say, what have we been thinking about most recently? And this is about a week ago. We were traveling, actually we're in the very far north of Canada. We were on a ship trying to make it through the Northwest Passage. It didn't make it. So we ended up in Resolute. Now you should all know where Resolute is. We used to think Edmonton was far north. But getting from Resolute to Edmonton through Yellowknife is a 6-hour journey. And it's straight south. So we were really far north. But that was maybe just over a week ago, and we got home and picked up one of the latest Harvard Business Reviews and read an article by Clayton Christian. So you know the innovator's dilemma. He's the guy that dreamed it up. He says that the most important thing you can do when you're thinking about how things work is to create categorizations. And he used to categorize innovation as sustaining and disruptive. And he thought he would recategorize innovation in a slightly different way to try and address the, do you see my pointer? To try and address the, to try and address another way of thinking about, things like our jobless recovery and how come that happens and stuff like that. So he thinks about it a little bit differently now, and he categorizes innovation 3 ways, not 2. Thanks. This would be disruptive or market creating or empowering, depending upon how you want to call it. He calls it all 3 things, where you have an innovation that's just for the high-end market, and then you drive it into a wider and wider and wider market by driving it down low end, by reducing cost and power and all sorts of things like that. For instance, voice over IP replacing all the long distance in telecom, like almost overnight. So that's disruptive, or he's going to call it market creating, because in this environment, it creates jobs. In fact, he says, possibly most of the really new jobs in the economy are created by disruptive innovation. And then there's sustaining, where any company that's good at something and has a good market just keeps getting it better, moves up market, adds more and more features, makes the customers happier and happier. Only the problem is, of course, the expanding stuff down here wipes them out of the market if they forget their customers they're not serving. And that doesn't create many jobs. It doesn't use much capital either. It just keeps things going. And then there's efficiency innovations, which the outcome of that is that you get more efficient, like he says, take Walmart, for example. A much more efficient way to distribute goods through retail, and it basically eliminates jobs and frees up capital. And it used to be that freed up capital then would go back into disruptive innovations. But he notices that since, maybe the 70s, when shareholder value became an important concept, or when it became important to preserve capital, that the business schools started teaching that there were all of these metrics you had to do in order to be a good company and get shareholders to like you. Things like, basically anything that meant use your capital fast, get fast returns on asset, or anything like that. And what that did was it drove the CEOs to say, what's good, what drives up my share price, is these kinds of innovations, efficiency innovations. And we stopped investing in the job-creating innovations of disruptive technology. So the capitalist dilemma is, by doing the right thing for long-term prosperity, turns out to be the wrong thing for investors, according to the tools that guide today's investors. So, well, maybe there's a mistake. Maybe we shouldn't be focusing on return on capital because maybe capital isn't scarce anymore. And the thing you worry about is what's scarce. And it's not capital anymore. Capital is actually pretty available. It's just looking for way higher returns maybe than it can get. So the rule that these are the commandments that show you where you invest your money are probably wrong. That's his capitalist dilemma. And I think you're going to hear more about it. And it occurred to me when I looked at that and I said, yep, I can see that. That makes a lot of sense to me. There's some nice videos and Harvard Business Review article on this. Makes a lot of sense to me. So the interesting issue, though, is if these aren't the metrics that drive strategy that companies should be thinking about when they're doing stuff, what are the metrics that companies should be thinking about when they do stuff? And it occurred to me that people with a lean mindset don't think first and foremost about return on capital or anything else when they make strategic decisions of how to focus their company. They make decisions based on a few other things. In fact, they believe, if you want to think one way about a lean mindset, is that financial results are a second order effect. Financial results come from some other focus that's really intense. It comes from a lever like very energized employees. Employees that are applying their brain power and their discretionary thinking to making the company successful. And if you have a whole bunch of employees, but they're not trying to use their brain power to make the company successful, you're losing, more of a scarce resource than you are if you're worrying about people being busy and spending hours. So energized employees that really care about helping make the company successful is one. And another one is delighted customers. And you can see this in a bunch of the companies that have become extraordinarily successful without worrying quite so much about shareholder value. Like Amazon says, sorry guys, we're not going to worry about shareholder value. And if you're a shareholder that's looking for that, go invest somewhere else because we are going to delight our customers. Or Apple saying, we got to have insanely great products. So really focusing on the customer becomes the thing that causes the second order effect. Or making a difference in the world, making a difference in consumers' lives, making a difference in the community, or really delivering value fast. So these are the levers that tend to create the financial results in people that think with a lean mindset. So they start first with, when we delight our customers, the profits will follow. When we understand how to deliver rapidly, we have the most efficient organization. When we make a difference in the world, people pay attention to what we do. When we have energized employees, we have the best use of the assets that we have in our company. So that kind of thinking means these are the first things you think about. These are the things that you, well, I don't want to say measure, but you analyze. So if you get these levers right, then the financial results will follow. And so the kind of things you want to analyze are engagement, employee engagement, reputation of your company, impact on people's lives, and flow. So these would be the primary lean measurements or analytics. And I certainly don't have time in an hour to talk about all of them, so we chose delighted customers. Okay, so that's kind of in a way of introduction. And I want to talk about things to think about in delighting customers. So to me, delighting customers in a software is in your product kind of organization. Or what you do is use software as the brains of something that's going to go to customers. And you have to think about a couple of things. One of the things that we have seen on the internet is really well-designed software from a user perspective tends to be a very important driver of delighted customers. And this isn't just about user interaction. It's a much bigger concept than that. So the question is, how important is it that it's one of the first things we pay attention to? Well, there are two areas. One is sometimes you want to pay first and foremost attention to engineering, and second is you want to pay attention first and foremost to design. It's going to depend on the kind of product and the lever that it has and the kind of customers you're talking about. But this is a story about GE Healthcare, and they make, these kind of things. So design, you'd think here, is all about engineering. But Doug Dietz, who's the principal designer at GE Healthcare, he'd been doing this kind of stuff, and at this point he was principal designer of MRI and ultrasound machines, and this was his new baby. But he was taught as a designer that the first and most important thing that you have to pay attention to when you have when you design a product is to make sure that the customers are happy, are enjoying the machine. And who's the customer here? Hospitals. So you go and interview and see how the nurses like it? That's okay. Patient? That's the way he looked at it. Of course, he actually said both. Okay, so he happens to, the GE Healthcare is in Milwaukee. Actually, Tom and I both were born in Milwaukee, and it's pretty close to where we live now. So I kind of like Milwaukee, Wisconsin. But anyway, that's where he is, and there's a hospital there called Children's Hospital, and it turns out that's where his office is, and from a local perspective, one of the first ones of these machines was bought by Children's Hospital in Milwaukee. So he went over, and he wanted to see his baby. He'd been working for years on this, and he wanted to see how it was used, how it looked in use. So he went to the hospital, and he was being given a tour, and he was so proud of it, and the nurses liked it, and all of that sort of stuff. And then a nurse came in and said, I'm sorry, but you're going to have to leave because patient's coming. And so he walked out into the hall, and he looked down the hall, and what he saw was this. He saw parents taking a child, this 5-year-old, towards the machine, and the very, very upset child to begin with, and then he turned and looked at this thing and let out an absolute blood-curdling scream. Terrified. Now, Doug Dietz was really decided that he'd failed. And then he started investigating and discovered that 80% of children ages 3 to 7 require sedation to do an MRI. 80%. Now that's not even safe, let alone all sorts of other things. And parents aren't particularly thrilled about it. And so he went back to his team and he said, well, we're not done. We have a new goal for our machine, and that is that children who come in and get an MRI are going to have to get up on that table and lay still gladly and be happy, be comfortable with the experience when they walk out of the room. That's our goal. So what did they do? They had to figure out how children think. And so they immersed themselves in things like the Children's Museum. They had child psychologists talk to them. They went to libraries. They got down on their hands and knees and took a look at this from a child's perspective. They listened to it and heard how scary it was. Okay? And they said, okay, well, that's not going to do. So then they came up with an idea, and the idea was that the best way to hit this demographic, 3 to 7, is through their imaginations. That's what they were taught from these sessions. And so they said, so how could we use imagination? I mean, this could be anything, right? So they decided it could be anything. For example, it could be a pirate ship. And so they created pirate ship, aquarium, submarine, and then they gave parents books. And the books come home at night, and the parent says, tomorrow you are going to go to an aquarium. And when you get to the aquarium, you climb up on the table, and if you lay really, really still, then fish will swim over you. Or whatever the story is, okay, for the one that the parent chooses. And it turns out it worked. Okay, so these are decals, then some music accompanying it, all sold by GE. And as it turns out, when children did that, they virtually eliminated the sedation. Now, if you eliminate the sedation, you eliminate risk, you eliminate time, and you make parents a whole lot happier. And what happens then is that the hospital gets a whole lot more patients. So It worked really well. All told, it was a brilliant move on GE's part, sold a lot more machines, but that was not what it was about. It accidentally sold a lot more machines. It sold a lot more machines because he focused on a customer that he said was a big customer of his that wasn't being served by his machine. So it's that you need to focus on customers that really matters when you want to, and then profits follow. That belief is a very useful belief. We worked with a company in, it's called Sphere of Influence in Washington, D.C. And they used to be really agile. In fact, they led some of the agile stuff and then maybe some of the lean stuff in Washington, D.C. area. And then they said they had a problem. They interviewed clients who said they were satisfied. Yeah, sort of. Satisfaction was okay. But they were not thrilled. They weren't delighted. They were just kind of satisfied with their work. And they realized that Agile's intense focus on customer priorities and just-in-time story creation and grinding it out was stuff that created software, okay, but not design. It was just plain stuff. They didn't. It was no wholeness, no likability, nothing like that. It emerged as it was thought about one customer-driven feature at a time and then implemented. Does that sound familiar? Okay, that's not design. That's one customer-driven feature at a time that's implemented, whether it fits into a whole strategy, creates wholeness and likability or not. And they decided they were going to change from a design company to from a software development consultancy to a design center. And now, one of the most interesting things they said was engineers make things work, designers make things people like. We want to be both. And so we're hardcore software engineers, but we look at beauty and elegance too. And so they don't want to be design people or engineering people, they want to be product people. And in order to do that, they basically say if you make that mental shift, then you look at your customers as an audience. Remember that little crying child, an audience. And you play to the audience. You don't enjoy a theatrical production just because it did what it was supposed to do, just because it's part of a subject. It's because it was good. And they wanted to make software that was good. So they realized they weren't going to defer design to clients anymore. That was wrong. They were going to invent the technology and the design themselves by making sure that they made sure their clients got what they really wanted and needed and had a wholeness to it, rather than just, you tell me what you want and give me priorities. So they don't allow features in their software if they don't think it contributes to the wholeness of the product. Okay, these are a government contracting firm that has decided to tell government that if you think that's an interesting feature, but it doesn't fit into the whole concept of wholeness and well-designed stuff, sorry, you're in the wrong company, because we design complete whole products, stuff that has a strong center. And they had all of their software engineers figure out, go understand design, do design training, and understand how to create well-designed software. It was a very successful strategy because really well-designed stuff is something customers tend to love. But it was a pretty bold strategy for a consulting firm sitting in the Washington, D.C. government area. Pretty interesting. They say, these days when we ask our customers to rate our work, we find they're not just satisfied, they love our products. And that's where you want to be, where people love what you do. Now, it's not always about design. So now I'm going to say, sure, that's what design is about. And design is critical to create really delighted customers, sometimes. But sometimes the key lever is engineering. And when engineering is the key lever, then you need good engineering. And that doesn't mean, I'm not saying good engineering design, I'm saying just plain old good engineers. So this is Computer Magazine, and it's July 2012, yeah. And there is a article in here by Jerome Israel, Why the FBI Can't Build a Case Management System. Now, it's interesting because Jerome Israel was in charge of putting this case management system in place, at least one iteration, one life cycle of it. So he, after, I don't know, you'll see how many dismal failures, decided to write up his opinion about how come, why not. So in 2001 to 2004, there was about 170 million spent trying to create a virtual case management file system, and it failed. See? So, it's 2001, that's 9/11, 2004. We should have our records much more automated, and here we are 3 years later, and okay, well, that was a failure. So then they started again, and this is where Jerome Israel came in at 2005, and he came in and they were racing to put together requirements to try again. And he was a little uncomfortable with that, but he was a CTO. But basically, they put together requirements, they put it out to bid. They should have known something was wrong when they had a hard time even getting people to bid on it. They finally got some bids. They accepted bid, and they kind of went along with it for a long time. They actually they had a government study. What went wrong? Okay, that's a good idea. And they decided that what went wrong was bad project management. Okay? Since what went wrong was bad project management, they decided they needed to train the project managers. And so they did, okay? And so now they're going to have good project management. Now, what the interesting thing is, that made project managers even more powerful with regard to the engineers that were in the government, and there weren't very many of them. So there was even less engineering input into how this thing was designed. And by the way, that was largely abandoned too. And finally, after Jerome sort of was dismissed, in 2012, it was developed internally by a bunch of folks that went down into the basement and used Agile techniques, talking to the FBI agents all the time. And in 2 years, they had it done. They had at least the first iteration of it done. And it cost about 5% of the overall total cost to start from scratch again, or mostly scratch, and make it actually work. So this is not a new story. You've heard this story before, right? We can go to any government anywhere, not just governments, and hear this story many times. This was just pretty egregious. But the neat part about it is it also has an interesting analysis published in a very prestigious computer magazine about what went wrong. And he said, look, there were 3 wicked technical problems. Very difficult, challenging technical problems. One was security. Okay, this is an FBI case management system, massive security issues. One was migration. They had all kinds of existing paper records. How were they going to get them there? And one was integration. They were using all sorts of off-the-shelf software because that was what the government did. And how to get it all to play together was more than a little bit of a problem. Massive, wicked problems. Nobody in the FBI understood these problems. They didn't have anything like the engineering skill to even think about what kinds of problems these were. So they focused on program management. And of course, the contractor wasn't being directed to think about there, and they basically ignored these problems. They in fact put an Agile technique in place. They did iterative delivery. I think it was even monthly, and it all looked good for quite the long while until they actually came to when it had to work. And they discovered that all that Agile and incremental delivery had failed to address the 3 key engineering problems. And so they were all done, and they'd actually got sort of even a user interface, and it kind of half looked good, and it simply hadn't started to address the tough problems. So his claim is that if the government doesn't have serious engineering skill to manage these kinds of programs, they're not going to be able to be successfully done. Without great engineers, government contracts are basically just plain going to fail. Now, there are plenty of other explanations too, but the fact is that when you have a serious set of serious technical problems that have to be addressed, you need great engineers to address them, period. End of discussion. You can have all the processes in place you want. You can do all these good things that you want, And if you're not have deep understanding and good addressing of your deep engineering problems, it doesn't make any difference. You have to understand that software is technically complex and it's not getting any easier. In fact, right now we were just at a software conference called FlowCon in San Francisco, and there was an awful lot of people in ops that were there, not just because FlowCon is really about continuous deployment. So there were operations people, and there were people, product people, and there were development people, and quality people. And the operations people said, once upon a time, you could be in ops, and that was where you went if you weren't particularly good engineer, right? If you were just, just getting in, had no technical background. Not anymore. Some of the most tricky and serious engineering problems these days sit in ops, where we have, where we're online, we have threats, we have security, we have, well, you name it. It's a really difficult world to be in. So then when the problem is engineering, you've got to have great engineers. When the problem is design, you need to have great designers. There's no way around that. And you have to know which kinds of problems are your key problems. And pretty much we can talk all we want about Agile and methods and process, but if we don't understand those two things, when do we need great engineering and when do we need great design and how do we get that to happen, then we're going to continue to have software disasters. So let's talk a little bit more about design. This is Tom Gilbert. He wrote Principles of Software Engineering Management in 1988. It's in his 19th or 20th or 21st printing. I don't know. It doesn't matter. It's been very popular. He started writing about evolutionary software development in 1983. Okay, so he's been this proponent of evolutionary development of small releases and small deliveries for a very long time. It's not like this is a new idea. Sorry, we didn't invent it in Agile. And when it came around, Agile, he said, yay, oh, this is cool. But he watched from the side, and he has been beating up the Agile community, especially in Europe, because he lives in Norway, ever since. In fact, the last article he wrote was, Agile has wasted its first 10 years. So how did it waste its first 10 years? Well, he said, here's how you should be running a project or an effort of any type. You start by understanding the critical few measurement results that define value. This is one page. Okay, in projects we sometimes call it a charter. We have 4 lines that have 4 measurable things. We do business cases on them if they were achieved, and then we totally forget about them, and that has nothing to do with what happens after that. And instead, he said everything should derive from those 4, 10, whatever, measurable objectives, and make sure they're business results, not technical results. Something that will actually make one of the stakeholders care a lot about having it done. Something that you can measure. So those are requirements, right? Many of the so-called functional requirements are not requirements, they're designs. So if you have a big requirements document, it's not requirements, it's a design. Somebody's interpretation of what those high-level requirements actually should be in detail. And what we've done is we're giving the detailed requirements document to the technical team, not the problem statement to the technical team. So what you should do is give the technical team the freedom to figure out how to deliver these results. There are very few Agile processes that make that possible. Because we're not giving technical teams challenging problems to address and measure their progress towards a solution. We're not letting them engineer solutions to problems. We're giving them the solution. And I don't care if it's called a requirements document or a bunch of stories. It's somebody else has defined the solution and is telling the technical team how to implement it. And those people who have defined the technical solution, whether it's requirements or stories, Are they seriously good engineers, or are they amateurs? Tom's point is, more or less, more often than not, they're amateurs, and you're getting amateur design. And so the worst scenario I can imagine, he said, is when we allow real customers, users, our own salespeople, he says maybe even product owners, to dictate functions and features to the developers, carefully designed as customer requirements. If you go below the surface of these false requirements, you're going to find they're not requirements, they're bad amateur design. So think about that. What does a development team, a technical team, whether it's got designers, good engineers, good software people, good ops, but a technical team that's going to design, what do they get? How do they know what to do? That's the key thing right now. How do they know what to do and that it's the right thing? Are we giving them problems to engineer solutions to? Or are we telling them what to do? And if we're telling them what to do, we're going to have to stop. So I was an engineer. Actually, I never got an engineering certificate, but my job title was engineer for many years, and I did process control systems, which controlled great big pieces of equipment. And Tom says it's the wrong picture because that's not how I looked back when I was doing this. However, I did an awful lot of stuff, and it was almost always successful. And I was designing software that controlled massively big equipment. By the way, in my opinion, one of the most fun jobs there is. It was so much fun to see this big equipment move around and say, that's my software doing that. And you know, if something's wrong, you know it really fast. I can tell you stories of that, but I won't. Okay, so when I was an engineer in a process control organization inside of 3M, here's what our requirements looked like. The software, the system, the process control system has to make good product when married to the process, which is being designed upstairs by those engineers. It has to be on time. And there was a deadline because when you're building a plant and putting in a new process, being late is probably the most expensive thing that you can do. So it was never late. That wasn't a discussion point. We had deadlines, and they were never violated. Operators had to find it convenient to use, because if they didn't, they would find a way to defeat it. That's what we were told. And so if they didn't like it and they defeated it, it was our problem. We did not engineer something that they would find convenient. And if you didn't know what an operator was like, you better go find out. And it will be maintained by the plant engineer, a very smart person, but really only one. And there's a lot of equipment in a world goods manufacturing plant. So it better be something that that engineer can handle. And those were the requirements I got. One more. Oh yeah, that's right. It had to contain the latest technology. Okay, it's not we want to play it safe. For heaven's sake, this thing is going to be around for 30 years. It better be the newest stuff. And that's why I was there, because I was the one that could do programming, and that was one of the latest things. And so the electrical engineers had me, sort of substitute some of their stuff for mine. So I had lots of senior engineers who knew how to do process control systems to give me advice, but nobody told me what to do. Only here's the requirements, and here's the people who can give you advice. And every morning we met in the process control engineering manager's office and had coffee and solved the world's problems and solved the company's problems. And every so often we actually talked about what we were doing. It might happen. And it wasn't like, 15 minutes and it's your turn and you only get this many seconds and what did you do yesterday? None of that. It was, well, how are your kids? And by the way, the division, my manager always knew what was going on. So did the senior engineers, and everybody knew who needed help. And it was his job to make sure that everybody who needed help got it. Even though there was a project manager, we never saw him, because if we didn't get that done and done well, meet these requirements, then my boss' job would be on the line. And so, he just made sure we had what we needed. Everything besides this is design. So we have to think, what does it mean to do good engineering? And what does it mean, or maybe everything is design. And the engineer should design the engineering stuff, And the designer should design the customer-focused stuff. And that should happen without some intermediary or two intermediary. Or in our workshop today, I think we had 3 levels of intermediary between somebody wanting something, business analyst, product owner, oh, and there's a development team, long, far away from the real problem. So that has to stop, because we're never going to have stuff that really hits customer problems if we don't hand good design and engineering teams real problems. If we have amateurs in the middle interpreting what those problems really are. So let's talk about impact-driven development. Impact-driven development is working backwards from the impact that you expect the effort to have, the software development or product development or whatever development, on customers and their lives and their jobs and how they do things. So you start with, why are we doing this? If you ever seen this video by Simon Sinek about Start With Why, it's a TED video. He does a good job of explaining starting with why is the right place to get people engaged in the problem. Why are we doing this? The second thing is, this is Tom Gill, and this is his son Kai, who's still working and really a good guy in this area. Understand the impact that, remember, 1 page, few business-focused, measurable things that stakeholders are interested in. So you got to figure out who cares about the impact. How are they going to measure whether or not they got the impact they want? That is a valid question. You should actually expect an answer. And you might even make up an answer if they don't give you one. And what changes can we engineer or design to move the metrics in the right direction? Now, I'm not trying to create an entire solution for what the stakeholder wants. I'm saying, okay, let's see, the cost over time needs to move like this. Here is a solution that'll start it in the right direction. Maybe it's a 20% moving in the right direction. That's a beginning solution. And you need to not try to solve the whole problem. You need to have the engineers figure out what kinds of things they might try to see if it does move the metrics in the right direction. Which ones are the most important ones, the most likely to succeed. So when you go into the classic lean startup approach, take your most promising proposals or designs or changes and run an experiment. And does a metric move? Now, think about it. You can't do this without being able to deploy frequently and rapidly. Okay, you can't do this if you're only going to deploy every 2 years and it has to be done and complete. But anymore today, the idea of feedback pretty much requires you to figure out how to deploy it way more frequently than that. That's almost like, I don't know, software engineering of the future is going to be about continuous delivery, not about how to run projects. So prototype the most promising changes, implement a change only if it's driving your metrics in the right direction. And run a bunch of experiments. Doesn't matter if you're right. Now, think about this. People who are product managers ought to love this. Because should you be a product manager, you have to say, I believe that these changes to the product are going to have this kind of impact on, I don't know, sales or retention or whatever. They don't have a clue. They kind of think so. But, you know, they're no surer than anybody else. That's kind of, I guess, it's not from that much analysis. So if the development team can say, tell you what, you can give us 3 ideas and we'll test them. We'll tell you which one's best. We'll tell you actually the kind of impact each one has. Hey, that's really good news for a product manager, especially with rapid feedback. So there's not any real need, if you have a mechanism for rapid delivery, if you have a mechanism for delivering impact, then you can get product management really close to the engineering team that's going to engineer a solution. You can create a very virtuous cycle here and iterate rapidly until the impact is achieved, and then stop. So this is what I'm going to call impact-driven development. And to me, this is where we need to go to get delighted customers. Figure out how we want to delight them, and then use that to figure out what we're going to do. and don't think we have the answers, because, yeah, at the FullCon conference twice we heard a metric of, I think, if you have ideas, like your product manager, and you have, or whoever, and you have ideas, say you're a business analyst, whatever, and you think these things are going to have this result, you've got 50% chance that, but there's 100% chance that 50% of your ideas are wrong. Can't tell you which 50%, but for sure your ideas are probably only half of them are going to be right. And if you buy that, and just about every kind of experimentation from Microsoft down to all kinds of other places says that's fact, if you buy that 50% of the ideas are wrong, then for sure you don't want to implement them all, because that's just big waste. So what you need to do is figure out how to test them, figure out how to experiment with them, figure out how to figure out if those ideas are in fact going to have the impact that you want. So let's talk about how Spotify does that. Spotify's kind of a cool company. You all know Spotify? Anybody not know Spotify? Okay, so I don't actually even listen to their stuff, but they're in Stockholm and they are growing massively, and it's a pretty interesting company. And so when they do products, they think this way. They have an idea, and the idea needs to be something that's worth it to make their website more attractive to the world they're trying to dominate. And so is it worth prototyping? And the management group, and the managers there's a technical manager, product manager, and design manager. And the three of them take a look, and they say, sure, it's worth it. So then what they do is they form a small team with a product lead, a tech lead, and a design lead usually. If they need all three, maybe the design lead isn't necessary if it's a very technical thing like speed up the push of the button, but typically the three. And then they will have that team try a whole bunch of quick and dirty experiments, maybe paper prototypes, anything. And what they're trying to do is create a narrative of how, if this idea is implemented, it would look to a user. So it's a narrative of this thing in practice. And the narrative, and they have metrics. The metrics are pretty standard in the company. They know the 4 key metrics that they're trying to move, and then they may have a few other metrics based on what this particular product does. So they have a narrative of how it's going to work, just a story. Really, it's a story. And they have metrics of how they're going to measure whether or not it works. And after the management group says, okay, that's worth building, then they do what they call building it. And what they call building it means put together a minimum viable product, a small product which kind of shows how it works, well enough to get good feedback, but as few bells and whistles as you can make. And that minimum viable product is built by the same 3 leads plus a squad. A few more technical people are added. And then they do internal releases, because at this point they don't think it's ready for their customers to see. They want to keep it inside. So it's internal releases until the management says this is good enough for customers to see. Not all customers, just a few. Once it passes that, they're not building it anymore. They have a very small minimum viable product that the management team thinks is okay to show to a few customers. Then they go into a very long phase called shipping. This is shipping. Shipping says, let's release it to just a few % of our users, and let's do lots of A/B testing. You know what A/B testing is. And let's see how it drives our metrics. And we have our metrics, and we have our minimum viable product here, and our metrics defined, so we know what we're measuring, and we keep adapting until it looks good or until we get rid of it. And after constantly increasing the percentage of users and expanding it, and all of that, it finally gets to the point, and this is really longer than the other two. There's a reason why it's long here. Constantly gets to the point where it's ready for full rollout, and then shipping is done. So shipping is a long process, and then it's tweaked. And interestingly enough, at that point, the management group steps back and doesn't have any involvement anymore, and the team owns it and decides their own ways to make it into a full-blown product. So that's an interesting concept of thinking about how you do product development. It's all about having a team focus on how do I make this thing really work in a customer environment with a bunch of tests? So the concept that I had mentioned in the lean metrics on customers, delighted customers, is reputation. Now there's other metrics too. I'm going to talk about impact, but the first one I want to talk about is what you can do when you want to figure out whether or not you have delighted customers. The really simplest and first thing to know is what kind of reputation do you have amongst your customers? And of course, in a web environment, there's all kinds of ways to get, stars and that sort of stuff. But the first reputation system was actually on eBay. Because back when eBay started, way back, there wasn't things like reputation. And they were trying to get people to sell to people. Okay, so you sell to you. And you buy from him. And you don't know each other from a hole in the wall. And you live far ends of the country. You have no clue if you can trust each other. Okay? And they understood right from the beginning that only way eBay could conceivably work is if there was a trust built between the two. And the trust was built on reputation. So they put up the first reputation system. People thought they were crazy, but they got it to work. And it works well to this day. And that whole concept of reputation has spread, say, to TripAdvisor, which has incredible power in the hospitality industry. Just amazing power in the hospitality industry. It's all about your TripAdvisor rating there. Or Airbnb, where it's just like, actually, Airbnb and eBay are very similar companies. They do very similar things. eBay sells spare goods that you have, and Airbnb sells spare space that you have. And strangers come and buy your spare goods or buy your spare space. And should they do that, they need to know they can trust you. So here it's, again, a whole trust-based system. And these are very, very similar. And reputation is what it's all about. If you're selling to the public any kind of commodity, and they're doing any kind of checking out, it used to be, in our country, we could read consumers reports once a month. And every 2 years they might rate, refrigerators. And that was it. That was the only kind of information I had on how things were comparing. Not anymore. Now you had better think that your product is going to have an awful lot of people making lots of interesting comments about it. By and large, reputation has replaced quality as a metric, because if you define quality as customer perceived quality, your reputation, especially when it can be so precise, is equal to whether or not customers consider you have a quality product. How many here know about the Net Promoter Score? Not enough, so I guess I'll do a little bit more on that then. Okay, so remember I said financial metrics are a second order effect? That's a fundamental, every company I know that I would call lean believes that in their core at the most senior strategic levels. It's really a defining thing that you find in lean companies. It's really a defining mindset. Okay, so in that same vein, you don't look at profits as the same. You have good profits and you have bad profits. You have profits that come from delighted customers and profits that come from really annoyed customers. They are just buying your thing because they have to. Okay? If they have to buy your thing and they get an alternative, any alternative, they will scramble over to buy that, and if it turns out to be even a little bit better and a little bit less annoying, then they will buy that. So what happens with bad profits is you get profits that create annoyed customers. Nuisance fees, exploitive pricing, onerous contracts. We had all of these onerous contracts. Our telecom used to have 2-year contracts for all mobile phones. Okay, nuisance fees, that's do I have to pay for luggage on the airplane? In Canada, do you pay for luggage every time you fly? I flew on Air Canada from San Francisco and they didn't charge me for the luggage. And guess what? They didn't have trouble with the overhead bins being full. Strange thing. In Europe, no airline charges except the really cheap ones you'd never fly anyway for luggage. It just doesn't happen. But it's a real nuisance fee when it happens. Or exploitive pricing, because you can. the legacy airlines used to do this because they were the only airline in town until, say, WestJet comes along, and all of a sudden, I had a really inexpensive flight from San Francisco to Vancouver. You were kind of surprised, weren't you? He's not here yet.
Just a second.
Yeah, so there, the idea is that I couldn't figure out, because it always cost me several $100s a piece to get from anywhere in the US to Canada, no matter how long or short the flight. And then I realized that WestJet is flying into San Francisco, and I said, ha, that's it. That's how come it's now cheap to fly on Air Canada. So that's what happened here. Exploitive pricing disappears when a competitor comes in with better stuff. Now, bad profits not only create people that don't like you, they demoralize your employees, and they undermine your reputation in the market. And good profits, when people have a great experience, your customers are delighted, and you get top recommendations, that creates people who love you, and it really, by the way, creates employees who like to deal with your customers, because it's much more fun. It's no fun to have angry employees, no fun at all, or angry customers. And it fuels sustainable growth. So the classic Net Promoter Score is you rate, you say, how likely is it that you would recommend us to a friend, 0 to 10, and then these guys are promoters and these guys are detractors, and you subtract the percentages of the two, and that's your Net Promoter Score. And if it's above, say, 30 or 40 or 50, then you're probably a pretty good company as far as customers are concerned. But the thing is, it's just a number. And if it's just a number, then the question is, how do you change that number? And only if you really understand the reason behind the score, not just by asking people, but by interviewing them. Why do you have that? Did you give us that score? Can you understand what you need to do in order to change your score? So the next thing I want to talk about, so that's reputation. Okay, so we talked about, let's talk about impact. What was the first one? We didn't talk about that one. We talked about that one this afternoon. Okay, so one is reputation. The second thing for delighted customers is to really think about impact. And here are some really interesting business decisions that were made over the past, in this book, The Greatest Business Decisions of All Times. So they were made in the past, couple of centuries, but most of them in the last century, that had a massive impact on the success of the company. In fact, they were good business decisions, not bad business decisions. And if you look at these business decisions, as I quickly whip them up here, you will discover that virtually all of them are focused on creating either delighted customers or really delighted, energized employees, one or the other. And sometimes impact on the way the world works. So basically, you start in 1914. Okay, so this is a century ago, and Ford doubles its wages from $2.50 to $5 an hour. So why did they do that? It was all about employee retention. They had turnover of every couple months or 3 months. They could turn over the whole thing. And they made their wages double relative to other jobs that people could get. And all of a sudden, they had people that stayed forever. And they created a labor base that they could count on, they could train, and they went on to do the assembly line. And I think until 24 or 27, they dominated the automotive industry. In 1925, 3M's first 15% rule, implementation of the 15% rule happened. The first guy was ignored as he went off and did what his boss told him not to do, and he came up with masking tape. And, we still make masking tape at 3M to this day. And so the idea was that they discovered is actually when somebody is passionate about something, it's better if you just let them do it. So they made it more or less official. You can spend time doing stuff if you really have a passion about it, especially if it's creating a new product. And that has led to massive numbers of new products at 3M for decade after decade. And it has also been copied by a whole ton of other companies. This lasted until about the late 1990s, when an outside CEO couldn't figure out what all this new product development stuff was about and changed all the rules and made it no more fun anymore to do product development. But that's another story. In 1933, Nordstrom decided that it was way too much of a nuisance to have clerks argue with customers about returns. All it did was make for sour customers, make for a bad environment. So they said, guess what? All you folks that are in the stores, when people want to return something, take it. Give them the money and don't worry about it. And they've done that ever since, and it turned into a very, very customer-focused policy that they're famous for to this day. And it becomes a model that other people try to mimic, not always quite successfully. In 1952, right after the war, Boeing was a military supplier and decided to move into the commercial market. This was a massive, massive investment. Took many years to bring this thing out, and a huge bet your company risk. But they bet their company on the concept that where flying was going to go was into the commercial market. And there was a commercial airplane, it was McDonnell Douglas. So what they then did was they started advertising not to their airline customers, but to consumers. We are putting together a great airplane, you're going to want to fly it. And that combination allowed them to move into the consumer market. To this day, they dominate it, at least in the US. The HP way in 1957, okay, that's no longer there, but for a very, very long time at HP, it was all about trust and teamwork and risk-taking, and that brought H3 through a huge number of decades of growth. Toyota adopts Deming's quality principles. In the 50s, they tried to come to America and get their cars in America, and they were just junk. They were really bad. And couldn't sell a thing, and they went back and said, let's do this Deming thing. They won the first award, and they changed their whole philosophy towards quality, and the rest is history. And in '62, Walmart executives and store clerks started having weekly meetings where the associates on the floor would tell the executives what they needed to buy and what was selling and what wasn't and how the customers were feeling. And the executives told the store employees, here's the kind of money we're making, here's the issues that we have, and here's our executive concerns. And this went on for decades. Very tight coupling of the people that were executives with the people who were actually working in the store. In 1981, Soft Soap, little tiny Minnesota company, you know, pumps of soap. It was novel. It was a disruptive innovation at the time. And the problem was they had no patent protection. And they felt it was such a good product that if they just had some time, they would be able to really, you know, bring the market over to love their product. They really did. So how did they buy time? Well, they had worked with a supplier to develop the pump. They went to the supplier and said, what if we bought all the pumps you could possibly make for the next year? The supplier said, oh, really? And they said, yes. Big financial investment for this little tiny company, but it bought them a year in the market. And because they had that year, they were able to establish their brand. So massive capital investment on a bet that they had a delightful product that would have a high impact on the market. Similarly, like Boeing, they had a bet that they had a product that would have a high impact on people's lives. Well, Johnson & Johnson pulled Tylenol off the market where there was a poison scare. Do you all remember that? Those of you who don't, they were told by everybody that they were totally crazy to spend that money. It was absolutely not necessary, and they were recommended by every financial and even by the FBI, apparently. So you don't need to do that. But they did. And they bought customer belief in their safety and customer loyalty for a very long time by this decision. That was what that money bought them. And it was always considered one of the most brilliant decisions that they made. What they were broadcasting is, we care about customers. It's not about money. And everybody who buys their product says, these guys care about me. It's not about them trying to take my money from me. I like that. So when they get that message across, they create massively loyal customers. Intel Inside was a massive expenditure too. Huge amounts of capital, Why? To advertise to somebody who was not their customer. They don't sell to consumers. Never have, never will. And this is one of the most brilliant marketing campaigns because they created a pull demand from consumers by advertising to them. It's very similar to the Boeing advertisement. But, you know, what board would say, huh? How many billions of dollars are you spending to advertise to somebody who doesn't even buy your product? You got to be crazy. Samsung, in 1990 and thereafter, took its best top star engineers and marketing people and gave them a year sabbatical. Why? Because they said, look, we're Korea. We're just like a kind of a closed economy here. We have this one language, and we really have to understand how the rest of the world works. We have to speak their language, we have to understand their customs, and we have to have senior people in our company that do that. So we're going to take our best junior people right now today, we're going to send them all sorts of places and say, go there, learn the language, understand the customs, figure out what those kinds of people are all about, and then come back and then be a good engineer again. And because they created a huge number of people in their company that had really good sensitivity to what was going on in the rest of the world, when it did come time to expand globally, they had the people inside that were able to do it wisely. That is a brilliant decision. GM, when Gessner took over GM, he was told to split up the company for cash. IBM, excuse me. IBM, split up the company for cash. He was fully expected to do that. He had come from American Express. He knew nothing about technology. So they figured, you can't do anything like that. Well, actually, it turns out, American Express is a customer of IBM, was a customer of IBM. And he gets in there as CEO, and he looks at his executive team, and they have no clue what he, as customer, was thinking. Okay? He was a CEO of a company that was one of the biggest customers of IBM, and nobody at IBM had a clue what he wanted out of them. So he said to every one of his executive teams, you and every one of your direct reports will call on 5 customers in the next 6 months and find out what they want, what their issues are, what we can do to make them happy. And after every single visit, you will send me personally a 1-page report about what they want, what they're like, what their issues are, and how we can make them happy. So he had 300 people at the top of the company call on customers, and he made sure they did it by making sure they reported back individually every call to him. And it totally changed IBM's mindset towards customers, which had not been there up until that time. And of course, they didn't break up the company. The rest you probably know. And then I won't even say any more about Apple bringing back Steve Jobs and Zappos. Okay, so Zappos was dying in 1999, just about to go under, had no money, no nothing, and they came up with this idea of high impact concept. We are no longer going to have we're going to let customers, no shipping charges, they can return anything they want, and that's how we're going to sell shoes. Now, they're not the only one anymore who sells shoes like that, but that was totally absurd. I mean, almost every one of these decisions, if it went to a board of directors today, would have been vetoed. Every single one. These are not decisions based on financial metrics. And were they measured by financial metrics, they would die. And it's these kinds of decisions that make huge impact on the way the market works in your industry. So high impact decisions have nothing to do with financial metrics. It's creating great employees. Look at Samsung. Okay, they're great engineers. But here what they did was say, we need people who can move out of Korea fast and understand what's going on. So it was all about employee focus, making them great, making them energized, making them love what they do and contribute to the company, creating customers that just plain couldn't get enough good from that company because they loved it. Those are the kinds of impact decisions that are really important. And when you're doing software development, I propose you should be thinking along those lines. Not small payoffs. That doesn't mean you don't have measurable, even financial impact. But you also have to think bigger about how do we change people's lives? How do we really have something that the customers are just bowled over, pleased with? How do we create an environment where people really love to work? And when you start thinking about those things, you really get some different ways of thinking about how you structure your development organization. So I think what I'm going to do now is ask if there are any questions. I've got a final thing here that I'm going to show you. Engagement, reputation, impact, and flow are what I think are the key sort of analytics that lean companies think about. So with that, what do you guys think? Got any questions, comments, things you'd like me to talk further about? Yeah.
Yeah, how does the Spotify technique fit in with the overarching design principle that you were talking about earlier?
Well, there's two things about it. The interesting thing about Spotify is it's really about design. There's two keys to their design. One is their absolute belief that when you push the button, you have to have music now. Not music in a second, not music in a half a second, like music the moment you finish pushing that button. And so from an engineering point of view, their site is highly engineered for that instant response. But when it comes to a design perspective, at least they believe that all of the teams that are customer facing have designers as part of the team. And when they're doing the executive reviews on those different steps, they're looking for, is this something that I'd be proud to have my users see? So they have a triumvirate of managers that are reflected throughout the entire organization. One is design, one is product, and one is engineering or technical. And those are the three sort of legs to the stool that they think are fundamental to any product. So they're pretty good at design. I'm not saying that their design is great, but I'm saying that they do pay a whole lot of attention to it. In fact, they don't worry too much about deadlines because if their design isn't right, they don't want it out there. Yeah.
So again, with the Spotify, that diagram, what was the sort of the time frames that each of those stages kind of went through? Because in a way, it kind of looked waterfall-y, so I'm wondering to what degree, we're talking.
Okay, so one thing that you need to realize is that what they're doing in this first three steps, these here, is the smallest product that they can possibly put together. The smallest thing that they can try. And even there, they're doing experiments here, lots of experiments. They're doing internal experiments here. They're doing external experiments here. And when they're done, they have a minimum viable product, the smallest thing they can possibly release. So Henrik says, so say you want some transportation. You could have like a motorcycle. What would be a minimum viable product for a motorcycle? Not a wheel, because that wouldn't get you there. How about a bicycle? Okay, so if you think of the whole product as a motorcycle, the minimum viable product is a bicycle. So all these guys are doing, and all of this time is building that bicycle. And here is where the team is making it into a motorcycle. Adding an engine, adding all that stuff. So I don't see it as being waterfall. But I do see it as making sure before, and remember, I only release this to a few percentage of customers. So Henrik says that a really large amount of time is spent right here. A very large amount. If you were going to talk about lean startup, that's right here.
Okay, let me rephrase, I guess. What is the earliest point, how much time has passed from the inception of the idea and the first customer contact?
First of all, I don't know. And second of all, I can tell you what Henrik would say. He would say, it depends. It depends on the product. So I can't answer it, but I know that he wouldn't answer it because it would depend entirely on if what I'm doing is a tool for the internal developers, a button that's going to change the way that I react when I get a playlist thing, a search thing, a new website design. They would all have different time frames. A rollout to a new country, Now, I'll tell you one thing. Rollouts to new countries tend to be time constrained. Okay, they tend to be planned. But other than that, they don't tend to time constrain. Yeah.
From FlowCon, you mentioned that one of the takeaways you had was about ops, the role of ops.
Yeah.
What were some other takeaways that you got from this conference?
So one of the guys one of the keynotes was really cool. Mary Kagan talked about the IT mindset. And he makes a distinction that I make too. That's perhaps why I liked it. You know, I always like people who agree with the way I think. And Marty Kagan did. But anyway, he said that people with an IT mindset are people who are not designing products for customers. They're designing software for their colleagues in the same company. Okay? Rather than software for customers. And when you're designing software for colleagues, the rules are different. And the things that are important are different. And you get this thing called an IT mindset versus a lean mindset. And then he said, and he listed all of his attributes of IT mindset. And then I got up and said, here's what I think a lean mindset is. And so for me, it was like all the kind of cost center focused behavior that you get when you get in an organization that doesn't have impact metrics to drive what they do. When you can't drive from impact on customers, how do you know what to do? Okay, you think, how do I figure out how my development team, those smart people, can be given challenging problems to solve if I don't have any way of figuring out how I'm going to measure any impact, if I don't understand impact. It is certainly true that if I'm designing a new flow system for keeping track of invoices or whatever, I could have some measurable metrics. Generally speaking, however, that's not how those projects are run. So the IT mindset, can you remember any of the pieces of it? So that was another one that jumped out at me because it put words on the way that I tend to categorize software development as software product companies and companies that have IT departments that develop software for some other function inside the company, or people who have taken software development and even if it's for customer-facing products like, say, insurance companies or banks, I don't understand why they're not software companies, but they take their IT department and they put them off in some like side area, not in a line business. And when software development is a line engineering function, things are very, very different than when software development sits in an IT organization that has, especially if it's a cost center, but not only if it's a cost center, because they're not driven by metrics of the business unit. They're driven by typically some other kinds of metrics that are not really customer impact. And they think of customers as being people in business units. In fact, I said the way that you can tell if a company has an IT mindset is if anybody in the company uses the term the business. Okay? Anybody here use the term the business? Okay? If that is a phrase that is in common usage in your company, then your software development organization is an IT organization separate from business delivered value. But you've got to contrast yourself to a company that puts product managers with software engineers in their line business and creates products that bring revenue into companies and makes decisions based on that. It's a very different way of thinking about software development. And many of our practices don't make the distinction and don't think about that distinction. And I personally find it way easier to work in software product companies where impact does drive behavior than in IT mindset companies where it's hard for me to get a handle on why things get done. Okay? And when I can't get a handle on why, then all the things I know about driving from impact like sort of fall on the floor. So that was the other thing, this talk about what an IT mindset is like. That was really cool. If there are going to be videos available, and it was the first video by Mary Poppendieck. It would be fun for you guys to watch if you are interested in that. Oh, unicorns. How many know what a unicorn is? Oh, okay. Yeah, whoever was in the workshop today. You need to know what unicorns are. You need to know the definition of unicorns. Unicorns are magic creatures. Tom and I, as I said, we're just up there in northern Canada where there are narwhals. They really do have these horns, okay? And that used to, years ago, centuries ago, be sold as unicorn horns just because they sold better that way. At least that's what we were told. Anyway, a unicorn is a magical animal, and it can just do magic stuff. And a unicorn would be Google or Amazon or Facebook or Twitter, okay? If you run an IT department in a bank, they're like, oh, they're magic. There is nothing you can do to grow a horn. It's not, you're just a mule, and growing a horn isn't something you can even begin to aspire to. And so those are the unicorns, and we actually had a bunch of unicorns in our workshop yesterday in San Francisco. That was kind of fun. Salesforce. So those would be unicorns. They just do this magic stuff. And what's happening is all the horses are discovering that it's not as magic as you would think. That there is a way to get from where we are, this mule we are today, to having at least a bit of a horn, and we can become unicorns if we understand, first of all, why they're doing that kind of stuff, and then maybe some of the techniques. And probably the biggest why, because this was FlowCon, so it was all about flow, the biggest why, in my opinion, is the biggest thing that gets in people's way is the idea that you deploy all the time. And that doesn't anymore quite, but always used to seem so impossible. I'm a bank. How could I imagine all this? Isn't that dangerous? I need to know what's going to happen. I need to be safe. I need to be secure. This is so risky. That's crazy. We know today that the absolute safest, most secure way to deal with a massively complex, large-scale software system is very small incremental perturbations. There is no question about it. There is no safer way to deploy software than in very small incremental deployments. It's the least risky way. It's the best way to figure out whether or not what you're doing is right. Anybody who has, the larger your code base, the more you should be desperate for very small perturbations in deployment. And that's something that people in ops have figured out. It's not made it up to the executive suite yet, not even up as far as the CIO, but it's going to get there. Because that really is the most safe and secure way to deploy software. So in the end, you have to go to continuous delivery just to reduce risk, just to be safe, just to make sure that everything you're doing is already tested. And by the way, interesting enough, when you get there, you discover that in that long process, you were spending in the vicinity of 20 to 40% of it getting out bugs, wasting your time, that when you have this rapid thing, you find like instantly and fix like that. And all of that time that you used to spend with all of this hardening evaporates, and all of a sudden your productivity shoots up too. But you don't even do it for productivity. You do it for it's the only way to have a safe and secure, massively large set of software. You can't do it any other way. And why are these unicorns the great big companies, the ones with massive users and massive servers? Is because it's the only way for them to survive and be safe. And you have any idea of being big, you have to go that way. There's just no option. That's one of the things the ops people were saying a lot about. One ops guy said, I used to think that in order for this to work, we had to get all of our executives on board. Now I know I'm wrong. If the executives don't get on board, the company's going to die, so I don't have to worry about them anymore. Either they get on board or it's dead. And then I just go find another company. Because the folks in ops that have figured it out are really amazing. Oh, and one more thing. There was one guy there that talked about, what was the front-end ops? Yeah, front-end ops. Okay, so what he does, this is something, do you know what front-end ops is? So I didn't until 2 days ago. Front-end ops is really interesting and really tough. So he's working for, maybe it's Unilever? The company, his company puts videos onto browsers. Okay, that's what they do. And they discovered that there's problems when you put videos onto browsers, and customers will complain. In order to figure out what they complain about, they have all kinds of information that they can gather as they put that video into the browser. They can figure out the environment, what people are doing, how many other things are running, stuff like that. They bring all of that data in and instantly put it into an analytical machine that grinds out correlations until they can come up with some hypothesis of how to improve their service to customers. So they're sitting in a browser, they're gathering all sorts of information, and they're turning it into proposed stuff that they run through their product thinking organization and can implement within days. And this will improve the experience, and that will improve the experience. So front-end analytics means on the front, they're figuring out from usage what they can do to improve the customer experience. And it's becoming he says, really tough. It's becoming a really big area. So lots of stuff going on in that world, and it feels like unicorns, but it's not. This stuff is not that mysterious. Yeah, I don't want to that. Okay, more questions? Yes.
The results-driven development or the impact-driven development is very powerful. But I can't help but notice that the analytics that you described, and especially the Net Promoter Score, customer satisfaction, et cetera, they're all, to a large extent, lagging indicators.
Yeah.
Do you have any leading indicator components of those that you can point us to?
I think I don't have any that I can come right out with. Actually, I've almost always found that when we're going out to market, lagging indicators, unless we can do metrics and analytics, are about the best we can do. I think we get a whole bunch more indicators a whole bunch faster when we're in a web environment and we can bring in analytics. And now, wow, front-end analytics, holy cow, that's really interesting. But on a large scale, if you go back to my impact-driven decisions, the list that I gave you, those guys were not making that on any metrics. They were making that on their belief that if they did these things, made this kind of investment, that over time, that's what the company would have to have in order to go where they wanted it to go. And those are not made those kinds of decisions are way beyond metrics. They are saying we run the company with people who are supposed to have really good instincts and vision about where the strategy is. And those decisions were made by very good strategists.
Isn't that a bit of a survival bias, though? Those are the bold decisions
Oh, yeah.
that worked.
There were plenty of bold decisions that didn't, right? But I still think, personally, that no action gets you nowhere.
Agreed.
Okay, and action gets you somewhere. I do want to show you something on that. If anybody has patience for one quick story here. See this? Back in 1950, this is how much revenue newspapers made from advertising, want ads. Okay? And then something happened. Right? And it fell off the cliff back down to 1950 levels by 2010. And virtually every newspaper in the world is in a world of pain because of this, with the exception of the newspapers in Norway. Okay? And again, this is about seeing the future and seeing it fast enough and being bold enough to take action when you see it. So this is Norway, and these were a bunch of newspapers in Norway. The lead one was this Aftenposten, which was in Oslo. And they got together into this group called Schibsted, and they decided way back in 1996 that this internet thing was a problem. Now that's, think how many of you would have worried in the newspaper business about internet in 1996. And there they are in Norway, where there's even less, well, actually, they had pretty good technology there. And so they decided that they were going to put together an answer. And Aftenposten put together a non-disruptive, they put together a project to figure out how to have a website that was going to do want ads. And it was branded with a newspaper. They had, it was a project that had, some people that weren't dedicated, and it was bundled into their business model, and it was a total failure. But they said, I'm sorry, but this internet is a real problem. We have to think. And so in 2000, 4 years later, they tried another approach. They completely rebranded this. They had a separate organization. We worked with this organization, so it was a lot of fun. And their focus was on attacking the main revenue stream of every one of the newspapers in their parent. Now, what company forms a subsidiary to kill the revenue stream of all of its members? That's what they did. Not only did they form it to do that, they created ads in the newspapers that directed people to the website. What's this saying is, you know what? If you were advertising this in here, that's all you would get. But if you were online, that's what you would get. Don't you want to go online? So what we have is one ad saying, get the heck out of here and go online. Now, they said they had incredible pressure from their American stockholders that this was a really dumb idea. And I am sure that they did. Okay, I have no doubt that if you look at it from even medium-term financials, it was a really dumb idea, especially in 2000 when you really couldn't see. Very few newspapers had this kind of perception. But you know what happened? Is right now they have the #1 position in job advertising, real estate, cars, general merchandise, display advertising, #2 in travel, and in hiring people that do jobs for you, shop, craftsmen. Their brand awareness is 96% aided, 92% unaided. They have 2.5 to 3 million unique visitors per week. Everybody in Norway knows Finn.no. It's Norwegian language. And they have 110 visits per Norwegian. I think this is in a month. And the average Norwegian spends 21 hours, and again, I think this is in a month. And their ads amount to about 20% of the GDP of Norway. Now that doesn't mean they sell that much, but their ads amount to that much. This is an amazingly successful, and this is a money machine, I guarantee you. In fact, to look at it, this was 2001 for the whole group, and this is here, and the percent being contributed in 2001 to revenues was 2% by online, and now it's 35%, and in 2011, 55% of the revenue came from this Finn.no. Yeah?
So Schibsted boldly took one monopoly and created another. What's awesome about that?
Well, every other country saw eBay and other places like that come in and take their revenue away and bring it there. So it was the only place that I have found anywhere in the world where the newspaper advertising revenue stayed there except in China. Okay? So if you go other places in Europe, all this work is being done, but it's typically not being done by a French or a German or Spanish company. It's all going to the French subsidiary of eBay or something like that. So what they did was they kept inside of the country by beating them out. They kept all of the revenue from advertising, and they created new revenue. They have way more revenue now than they ever had before. And the blue stuff is their print media, and that is their online. So they went online and disrupted themselves, and I don't know of any other set of newspapers that even began to be successful in that concept. They kept their own revenue because they figured out they had the perception that they needed to disrupt themselves, and they just went ahead and did it. And again, that's not the kind of decision that you make when your financial metrics are driving your decisions. That's the kind of decision you make when you say, long-term survival, this internet thing is a huge threat, and we've got to take very bold steps to counter it, and we've got to do it now when nobody believes we're right. Yeah, right now they're moving to mobile first. So anyway, that's probably enough questions, enough talking. So I want to thank everybody here, and thanks for coming.